Hello again and welcome to Teacher Training Webinars. I'm Jo Kakonga and this time we're going to be looking at using authentic materials. So I guess the first question is really, what are authentic materials? What actually am I talking about here? I think really the definition here is any text, written or spoken, which is not produced with a language learner in mind, that's produced for authentic purposes then. Okay. A lot of these texts are going to be things which are produced with native speakers in mind. So for example, newspapers or magazines maybe. But it might be other texts, for example, menus in English cafes or restaurants. It could be brochures, it could be pamphlets, anything of this nature, anything which is produced for real communicative purposes, I suppose, as opposed to language learning purposes. Often, of course, these are produced for native speakers, but there's more of a grey area these days because a lot of the language that's used in the world, particularly in the internet, is not between native speakers. So I think to say that they're produced for native speakers would not be true, certainly anymore, but they're certainly produced not with a language learner in mind. I'm giving the idea here that this is only written text. Of course that's not true. Song lyrics are another really good example of using authentic materials that you could use in class. Videos, films, that kind of thing. YouTube is great for using with learners because all of the clips are quite short, so that's really good. So any kind of text, spoken or written, which is not designed specifically for the classroom, this is what we're talking about. Now it might not be something that's published in this way officially. If you just tape recorded or recorded yourself or some other people talking to each other, that would be authentic material, as long as they weren't talking with the idea that you would use this in class, because in that case they would be probably grading their language. But if you just tape an ordinary conversation between your friends, for example, that's authentic material. So it doesn't have to be something which is published so much like this, although clearly that's often what we're using. So having a look at that, what aren't authentic materials then? Let's look at the opposite. Let's ensure we've got the definition right. So anything that is produced for the language classroom, this might be on the web, this might be course books, this might be games, what have you, these aren't authentic materials. Now please let me make this very clear, these aren't bad. Don't equate authentic with good and non-authentic with bad. That's not the case. They're just different. Okay, now there are good reasons to use authentic material, and we'll talk about that, but that's not to say it has to be used all the time, and all of these things are perfectly good and useful in class, but they're not what we're talking about today. Be aware as well that it's easy to mistake authentic experience for authentic material. So if I go into class and tell my learners about something that happened to me, that would be a good thing to do. That wouldn't be a bad thing to do at all. That would be good listening practice for them. But it wouldn't be authentic material, because if I'm talking to my class, I would be grading my language. Probably subconsciously, if nothing else, I would definitely be grading my language. And so that's not authentic, although it's a perfectly good thing to do in class. A very good thing to do in class, I think. But it's not what we're talking about today. Okay, so I think one of the big pushes towards authentic material comes from a reaction against some of the things that have been in course books in the past. Thankfully these things aren't quite so common anymore, but it used to be not at all uncommon to see dialogues like this in course books. How long have you been collecting butterflies? Which is a bit of an odd question anyway. I've been collecting them since I entered secondary school. Clearly nobody who asked that first question would get a response that was that complete or long. The more natural thing to to do would be just to say, oh, 3 years or since secondary school. Okay, how many butterflies have you collected? Again, it's a rather contrived example of a sentence here, and again a full sentence answer. I've collected about 400 rather than about 400, which would be natural. And we go on. Are there any rare ones among them? Yes, there are some. I got them in Thailand. And suddenly we have a change of topic entirely. My hobby is playing football. In order to accommodate this, how long have you been playing it? The present perfect tense, present perfect continuous tense actually, which is clearly the language that we're trying to, or that this dialogue is trying to exemplify. So we've got have you been collecting, I've been collecting, have you collected. So we've got the present perfect continuous, the present perfect simple, and therefore we need another example of this because we've kind of run out of the butterfly ones. So we have this very unnatural complete change of topic in order to allow another example of the I've been playing it. And another hobby of mine here, will you cook me a meal? Yes, of course. So this kind of language is clearly not only inauthentic, it's just misleading, because nobody would speak like this. This is the kind of language that I think used to be common in coursebooks, isn't generally anymore. But I think it's worth being really aware of the fact that here, in order to exemplify this language, you've squeezed the language into a mould that it really doesn't fit naturally. And this is the issue. So this is really the issue of this kind of language is not good for language learners because it's so unnatural. Most of the language these days in course books is either at higher levels, probably a lot of it would be authentic, but at lower levels it's often what's called semi-authentic. So let's have a look at an example of that. So here we go. What kind of food does this woman like? So we have a look at this woman. We think, oh, what sort of food does she like? Fish and chips? Possibly not, from looking at her. Okay. So then we have a text and we have to read to see if our prediction was correct. So that's a good gist task. And you can see that this text reads in a more natural way than the one before. However, it isn't authentic. I wrote it. Okay. It's that the sentences you can see are quite complete. In fact, they're very complete. There's not the sort of the stopping and the starting and the short sentences and that sort of thing that are common in normal speech. So this isn't an authentic model. However, it's a lot more authentic. It's nearer to that model. So we maybe call it semi-authentic than the text we saw before. And this is the kind of thing that's common in low-level course books. It is written for the purpose, but at least it's a reasonable approximation of how people would speak. So this is semi-authentic. So given that we could use this semi-authentic material, the question is begged, why use authentic materials at all? There are quite a few reasons, and I think the best one is this, that it gives them a natural model. Learners are wanting to learn natural English, and this encourages them, I think, to become better readers or listeners if they're used to what is a normal natural model. I think this is a really important thing too, is that learners feel that if they're aiming, that this is the final aim, if you like, this is what they need to be able to do at the end of their learning. So if they can do that, even if they don't understand everything, then there's quite that's quite a strong motivational force in knowing that it doesn't get any more difficult than this. This is important, I think. Arguably students could read lots of inauthentic material as well, but there's good research evidence that input is what improves language. So if you listen a lot, if you read a lot, this will help you to acquire language. It will give you, subconscious understanding of how language fits together, and it will help acquire language faster and better. If it's successful, it's very motivating. Again, this comes back to this, it's the fine line. This is what they have to do eventually. If they can do it, that's hugely motivating. Clearly, the opposite can also be true. If I look at this and think, I don't understand a word of this and I can't make head nor tail of it, that's clearly not very motivating. So I think that's a bit of a double-edged sword, but worth thinking about. And finally, and I think this one it's down the bottom, but it's actually really important, is that if you're using authentic material, it's much easier for the topics to be interesting and topical. If you want to talk about the news, for example, in class, then clearly newspapers are a good way of doing that. Course books tend to steer towards the same kind of topics. So by the time you've talked about the environment 16 times, or your family, or holidays, then this can be a bit tedious. So it's nice for learners to have a wider variety of material to interact with. So given all these really good reasons for using authentic material, what are the problems? Well, the big one, of course, is level. Especially at lower levels, it can be really demotivating if it's too difficult. The difficulty with authentic material clearly is that it's going to be lexically much more challenging than corresponding semi-authentic material in course books. So this is something to think about. You don't want to overload them and make it so difficult that they are going to give up. The other thing, of course, is that it's work for the teacher. If you're working from a course book, that gives you a lot of support. Course books aren't the be-all and end-all, but for those of us who are teaching 20 hours a week, especially if you're a novice teacher, they are a useful support, I think. And making up your own material takes time. You've got to find the material and you've got to make up the exercises, and this does take time. And if you use something that's very topical, which is a lovely thing to do, a really great thing to do in class, something interesting happens in the world and you don't take that into class and talk about it with your learners and look at some text about it, that's great, but you're going to have done all that work and you're very unlikely to be able to use it again because it'll be out of date. So those are issues. That doesn't mean that you're not going to do it, I hope, but it is something to bear in mind, I suppose. It's difficult to be thinking about, I'm going to do this, especially as a novice teacher, I'm going to be doing this every day. Might be difficult. Okay, so some solutions to those difficulties. I think one of the things is choosing your material carefully. This particular site, I think, is really helpful. I discovered this quite recently thanks to Scott Thornberry's blog. Actually, it came up in that. Twordy.com, and we'll just go and have a look at that now. So here's the website, Twordy. It's just like a Google search engine, except that it gives you a readability factor here. So I searched here for Titanic, and if I scroll down, you can see that the readings are colour-coded by how difficult they are to read. And they've actually got a number here as well, a readability level. I'm not exactly sure what that's based on. I assume kind of lexical difficulty and what have you, maybe length. But you can then choose something from this which is easier to read. So for example, if we go to So like this looks quite easy to read. It's got a fairly low level 366 readability level. If we have a look at this, this is really quite nice. There's quite a lot of stuff on here where you've got different stories about people who were on the Titanic, and the level here is fairly straightforward. The lexic is not that lexically complex, or it's quite straightforward narrative, and so quite easy for learners. So I think this is quite a nice idea, the search engine, that you can choose the sort of level that you want to give your learners. So I think that's useful. So there are other websites as well that will be helpful to you, for your learners. This one is a particularly nice site, 1,000 words, a picture makes 1,000 words, where people have uploaded pictures and written 1,000 words about them. Some of these are more complex than others, but there's some really nice ones in there. I'll go and show you an example now. So here you can see this website here. There are lots of pictures and they all have a story with them, so you can scroll down and the story is here. There are all these other pictures will all have different stories, so there's lots of very, very nice ones. Generally speaking, they're fairly straightforward. Again, narrative stories, and you've got a picture to give you an idea. So I think this is quite a nice website for lower level learners as well. Something else to consider is newspapers on the web. There are an awful lot of newspapers on the web. Whilst I usually would read The Guardian or The Independent and wouldn't set foot near the Daily Mail, I have to say that although it's politics I don't agree with, its lexical complexity is an awful lot easier than that of the broadsheets. So that's the Daily Mail and the Express are a good level, if you like, or an easier level than the broadsheets. So if you're looking for something which is easier for your learners, then those kind of things are easier than the broadsheets on one hand and the tabloids on the other hand. So, you know, something like that, I say it's lexically easier. This was an article that I just had a quick look through, and I found this one about Ben Fogle, which was quite nice. So we'll have a quick look at that. So here's a typical example of something from the Mail about Ben Fogle and why travelling is important to him. I think it's written in a very straightforward style. It's not lexically too challenging. With something like this, you've got quite an easy task in that you could look at the kind of places he's been, for example. It's quite a narrative style. So I think that this kind of text is really helpful, actually, especially, as I say, when your learners are a bit lower level. The other thing to think about really when using authentic materials is, you know, clearly you need to choose what you're going to give them, but the other really important thing to think about is grading the task that you give them. So, you know, I could give my beginner learners a newspaper and simply ask them, you know, what the date was, and they'd be able to tell me, even though they wouldn't understand very much of anything else. So I think that it's very, very possible to make the task possible even though they don't understand everything. And I think teaching learners the acceptance of not being able to understand everything is not a bad thing. I think you have to clearly, you know, there are limits to this, and, you know, my example of the date on the newspaper is probably not hugely helpful. For my beginner learners, I wouldn't probably give them that task, but I'm saying that I could. So with the text, for example, the Ben Fogle text that we were just talking about, we could just say, can you name all the places he's been? Now that's quite easy because they've only got to look for capitalised place names. but obviously with learners at a higher level, we could look at something a bit more difficult. So grading the task is definitely a way in which you can make more difficult authentic materials available to lower level learners. The other thing that you can do, of course, is to edit the text. Now, be aware that if you edit text, it is no longer authentic. That doesn't mean it's bad, though. It's the same as, I'm absolutely not saying that, this is something you shouldn't do. You can do that, of course you can do that. And it's perfectly valid. But be aware that it isn't authentic anymore. Now, there are two ways in which you can edit text, really. Probably the easiest thing is just to make it shorter. It's likely that authentic text will be quite long and maybe take too long in the classroom, maybe too much of an overload for your learners. So you could just cut it in half or whatever, use one paragraph of it. The other thing that you can do, of course, and it's easy now with the net, with the cut and paste thing, is that you can make something lexically easier. You can take out some of the difficult words or paraphrase small bits of it. As I say, do be aware it's no longer authentic material, but it's fine, and it's going to give them a better model possibly than if you just made it up, and it certainly avoids the "how long have you been collecting butterflies" syndrome. So these are things that you can do to help bring the level of the text within the reach of the learners. So the sort of things that you can do with authentic materials are exactly the same sort of things as you can do clearly with inauthentic materials, the sort of things that are in the course book. So with reading texts, you might want to do things where your learners are skimming, where they're looking over a text quickly to get the overall meaning of something. Scanning, where they're looking over a text to find particular information. You could look at text organisation, so paragraphing, how paragraphs are set out, topic sentences possibly if you're looking at more formal writing, also at sentence level organisation. So there's all sorts of things that you can look at in terms of receptive skills. If you've got a listening task, listening for gist, for the overall meaning of something, listening for specific information. So with questions, for example, could be multiple choice, true, false, listen for this particular piece of information. So the kind of tasks that you're going to use aren't different from the kind of tasks that you might find in course books. So I think looking at those can be a good way of getting some ideas for your own, making your own receptive tasks. Productive tasks, of course, the speaking tasks might be some kind of discussion maybe on issues arising from the text. Hopefully if the text is interesting, maybe topical, then learners will be interested to discuss aspects of that. Maybe some kind of role play based on the text or on people from the text. There are obviously writing possibilities. You could use the article or whatever it is as a model. So for example with the 1,000 words thing, you could give them pictures and get them to write, maybe not 1,000 words, depending on the level of the learners, might just be a paragraph on that particular picture, get them to bring pictures in and do their own. Or responding in writing to the article, perhaps Ben Fogel and his travelling experiences maybe write where they would like to go or something of that nature. So exactly the same sort of task examples that you'd have in course books as well. I mean, I think that the fact that the material is likely to be topical and hopefully interesting will mean that these things have more interest, I suppose. Okay. Clearly also this is a good way of looking at language. Taking language here in a real context is absolutely the best way of getting them to notice language. You might want to look at vocabulary. Clearly this is, there's likely to be a lot of vocabulary work in any authentic text that you choose to do, because the lexical load is probably going to be considerably higher than that in course books or with semi-authentic material. Also grammar. Now again, what you're not going to find, and what is not useful, is the kind of I've been collecting butterflies, how long have you been? So it's likely there's only going to be a few examples, maybe only 1 or 2 examples of a particular grammar area in a text, unless it's the simple past or possibly the passive in newspaper texts, where there will be a lot of examples. But clearly these things are useful to pick out in authentic context, because learners can actually see exactly how they are used by native speakers. I put here discourse analysis. Now that sounds very frightening. That really just means how things fit together. Now that might be on a sentence level. For example, very simple things like, Ben Fogle went to Canada when he was a child. He blah de blah de blah. So using the he here, the pronoun, to refer back to Ben Fogle. So that kind of thing. But it might be discourse analysis at a more text-based level, so how paragraphs fit together and that kind of thing. So all that sort of stuff is useful to look at in an authentic context. There's a really good blog, well, it's a great blog anyway, the A to Z of ELT, Scott Thornbury's blog, but this one came up quite recently, C is for construction, and he's got a really nice text there, article there, about looking for things in text which are not just about sort of classic grammar, but are also patterns which occur regularly in English. So I'll recommend that. All of the websites and the URLs that I'm putting up here I will put on a separate sheet, so you'll be able to get them easily. I know you can't get them off of this video, so don't worry about that, they'll all be there and you can have a look at that for yourself. So let's move on and look at some places where you can find some things. We've looked at a couple of ideas for authentic places to find authentic material, but there are several great websites which really have authentic materials just ready to go. And these clearly are helpful if you're a busy teacher. So I'd like just to have a look at a few of these. This one is one of my favourites. It's Jamie Caddy is the genius behind it, and we'll go and have a look at that now. So here's the website. It used to be called teflclips.com, if any of you have come across that, but he's changed it to this lessonstream.org. And he's got, mostly they're based on YouTube videos, but not all of them. The lessons are all laid out like this. You can choose by language level, various other bits and pieces. It also tells you here the language points or whatever that are involved. But if you click onto, let's have this one for example. So this is a song using Fairy Tale of New York. So clearly we've got the song here on YouTube, but he also gives you can download the lesson plan here, so it's all done for you. There's lots and lots of nice notes, very interesting. I think he has interesting lessons and he does really useful stuff. So and it's really all there for you. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, lyrics. So the whole thing is done for you. There's a lot of interesting things in there. It might be that you don't want to do all of the tasks in there, or you want to add to them or whatever, but I think it's a really great site actually for a start, and for some nice ideas for using authentic material in class. So that's one I personally like a lot. There's another couple that I wanted to recommend to you. BreakingNewsEnglish.com is really, really great for news, basically. There are thousands and thousands of articles on there, 3 new ones every week. And Sean Banville, who makes the site, has also got other sites as well. We'll have a look at that in just a second. The other one is that The Guardian has got some nice work, generally at a higher level, although they do say that some of it's at pre-intermediate level, but generally speaking the level's quite high, but it's got some really nice things. So let's go and have a look at those two now. So here's Breaking News English. So this is Sean Banville's site, and there's some other sites here. There's other lesson plans here from his other materials websites. It's got one that's a bit easier, and also his blog, which I'd also recommend. But so you can choose, look, you can see there are just, you know, a lot, and here we go, 1,513 earlier lessons. So if you can't find something in there that's of interest to your learners, then I think there's something seriously wrong. You can sort it by teaching adults, listening, speaking lessons and video. With all of these, so if we take, let's say, the British Queen celebrates the Diamond Jubilee, you can see there that you can listen to it. You can download the MP3. You can listen to this being spoken. The text is here, and then afterwards there are innumerable ideas for what you could do with it. So there's warm-up ideas, pre-reading ideas, while reading ideas, after reading ideas, surveys, discussions, multiple choice, and homework, and then all the answers at the bottom. You know, I would never use all of that with one class. They'd be, you know, so sick of the Queen's Jubilee by the end of it that you'd never get them to come back to class again, I think. But certainly, you know, you can pick and choose which of these things you'd like to do. Also, if your learners are using this at home, or you've got computers in class, then there are various different things that they can do. For example, here we put this missing words one in. You have the same text look with missing words. Okay, they can listen and type the words in the spaces, and they can check their answers. So there's lots of nice things to do that learners can do as extra, you know, as extra tasks for homework or whatever as well. So I think this is a really nice site. There's lots of great things there. So this is the Guardian page. You actually go to Education and TEFL. There's lots of links and various other bits and pieces, but you can see that there are the most recent lessons here. Here's a low intermediate one and an advanced one. It says low intermediate. I have to say, your learners want to be quite good low intermediate, I think, to do this. But again, you know, you can download this and it's all here. So it's based on a Guardian text, but you know, so here's the text here. It's not too long, but you've got various exercises that you can do with it. So again, this is all done for you. It's, you know, very easy to do, and there are other ones there to past lessons. So there's quite a repository there of things that you can use with learners. So I think that's, you know, it's helpful too. So finally, I just really wanted to give you a few ideas for websites where the learners can find reading and listening outside of class that might be at a level that's possible for them to understand or will be helpful. You might want to use some of these in class, of course. There's nothing against that, but I think a lot of these, you know, could be given to increase the learners' reading and listening outside of class. So we won't look at all these websites in detail, and some of them I've mentioned before, but you will have all the URLs on this separate sheet, so you'll be able to find them yourself. For listening, Lyrics Training is a brilliant site with lots and lots and lots of songs in English, actually in some other European languages as well, French, Spanish, German, which is a really nice way of learning English through songs. Learners, particularly teenagers, are often very keen to do this. It's basically listening and filling in gaps, but it's very well done, so that's a great site, and it's free. ELLLO, the English Listening Library, Language Library Online or something, is another great site, another free site. Lots and lots and lots of authentic material, people telling people's stories and various other bits and pieces, but at different levels. So although they are authentic, some of them are very, very short and straightforward. They all have transcripts underneath them. They have vocabulary exercises, they have comprehension exercises. It's a really, really nice site, well worth pointing your learners in the direction of that one. If you've got higher level learners, the TED site, TED.com, is just brilliant. Lots of talks by very interesting people on a wide range of really interesting subjects. You can also have English subtitles under the talks for most of them, and also subtitles in other language translated. So it's a sort of thing that learners could listen to with the subtitles on their own language, and then perhaps listen again with subtitles in English, and perhaps listen again without subtitles. So, you know, a sort of supported way in which they can listen to these things. So really interesting talks. Another one that's quite interesting for listening is VU. This gives you the opportunity to ask to ask anybody, the people who put themselves forward, questions, and they will make video answers. And you can also go and watch the archives of different people's answers. So this is a great way for learners to just go and listen to people speaking, but also perhaps, again, they're quite short usually, but also perhaps to interact with people by asking them questions, by sending them questions. Reading, we looked at The Guardian, which I think is, got a really nice site there. We looked at the Daily Mail, which is easier. We looked at 1,000 words. Again, I think that's the sort of thing you could easily set for learners for homework, to find one that they liked, and then maybe write their own. So I think that's a really nice site, in that the texts are relatively short. There's another site called Storybird, in terms of relatively short texts, which has virtual picture books. Some of these are aimed at children, and the concept looks childlike in that they are children's picture books, but some of them have got very, quite adult themes, not in a bad way, but in a sort of a thinking way. And I think it's a really nice site for learners to read from, because the support of the pictures, and generally the texts are quite short. So that's another really nice site to have a look at. And of course they can write their own storybirds, but that's quite challenging, so might not be something you want them to do. Might be with higher level learners. So all those URLs are on the site, so you can find those. Hopefully I've looked through some of them and find some useful ideas. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been helpful. There'll be another webinar up next month. Bye bye.